Third, compulsory masking is wrong because it is a usurpation of a person's most fundamental and unalienable property, their own body. Let me start with one simple illustration, which I hope is still uncontroversial. It would be morally wrong to force someone to donate one or a part of one of their organs, even if they were guaranteed to survive the donation with no negative long-term health effects, and even if that donation was essential and guaranteed to save the life of another person who would then be guaranteed to go on and save still more lives. Even though it is a good and praiseworthy thing, and would be, for a person to volunteer an organ donation, forcing them to do so would be utterly immoral. Such a forced donation, even assuming the outcome is a great good, would be wrong because the potential donor's ownership of their own body supersedes any interest that the potential beneficiary may exert through claims of social obligation or public health benefit. Mandatory face masking and compulsory vaccination commit the same fundamental error as compulsory organ donation, only they do so on a scale that is subtle enough to be confusing when people's minds are clouded by a state of fear. The same fundamental principles that prevent us from mandating blood donations also prohibit us from being able to morally mandate face masks and vaccinations, regardless of the effect on public health. I've heard the fight against COVID-19 compared to an actual war. I think that analogy is overblown, but okay, let's spend a couple of minutes drawing out some of the implications of such a response. If the principles of individual liberty can be extended to support conscientious objection in times of actual war against another nation, then those same principles must permit individuals to consciously abstain from personally engaging in one or more medical interventions, from one or more methods of combating a pathogen. If you support an individual's right to conscientious objection, then you should also support an individual's right to decline to wear a mask or receive a vaccination. In a sense, it's true that epidemics and pandemics are like a battlefield or emergency room triage situation where grim externally imposed necessity compels people in leadership positions on the ground to allocate limited resources as best they can. But compulsory interventions like masks and vaccinations are entirely different. They are a deliberate, self-directed seizure of fundamental custody from those who more rightly possess the limited level of control anyone can effectively exercise over that aspect of their lives. A superficially appealing, reasonable basis or rationale for most mass mandates and trite phrases like, "we do not have a constitutional right to infect others," make the demonstrably false presumption that we should all be considered dangerously infectious in the first place. As I pointed out, the evidence for the infection control benefits of face masks, even in medical settings, is far from ironclad, and working assumptions that may have some merit in a medical clinic or operating room fail when applied to the general public at large for the same reason that risk mitigation measures from other occupations should not be universalized. Just because it's a good idea for cyclists or horseback riders to wear helmets doesn't mean that joggers and pedestrians should be forced to do so, even if doing so would no doubt prevent a certain number of brain injuries. Likewise, the fact that eye protection has been highly beneficial for industrial workers and tradesmen does not mean that churchgoers need to wear laboratory goggles. A citizen's right to be free from external force or fraud and inviolate in their own person does not imply that his neighbors must do everything within their power to reduce the risk he incurs simply by existing. People who declare that your liberty ends where my safety begins to justify forcing their neighbors to wear masks are making the unjustified leap that those around them have an open-ended duty to do everything possible to diminish the risk that they incur simply by living. Your safety ended on the day you were born. We have the right to take personal measures to protect ourselves, but we don't have the right to compel our neighbors and fellow citizens to take those same protective measures, regardless of how seemingly reasonable or low cost those measures may be. We need to avoid committing the open-ended safety fallacy, which says that you can never have too much safety. Yes, you can have too much safety, and we've spent nearly a year proving that the open-ended pursuit of safety from just a single risk can be unbelievably destructive on top of being futile. Furthermore, once you abrogate individual liberty, all other stopping points become arbitrary and subject to the whims of people who have either fewer scruples than you do or have likely spent decades obsessing over particular problems to the exclusion of all others. In the case of infection control, why stop at cloth face masks? Why not go for supposedly even more antiviral safety and mandate medical masks, N95s, or even PAPRs? Disposable gloves and gowns are also used in medical settings, so why don't we threaten people with fines for being in public without those as well? That sounds like a good idea. Ironically, I find myself arguing for a different application of the precautionary principle. Our knowledge is imperfect, and because we don't know how many lives proposed impositions may save, and we don't know how many lives those same impositions may take, we ought to leave individuals free to choose what risks they will accept, even or especially in situations like a plague, real or imagined. For all we know, some new and far more deadly coronavirus will come along in 20 years, and everyone who got natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2 will be resistant. But those who avoided getting the virus this time around or got the vaccine will have no such benefit. Now that's a wild scenario and we should not plan on it, but that's my point. You can't deprive people of their liberties based on a worst case hypothetical scenario that someone dreams up, because such hypothetical scenarios will always exist. The mere existence of each one of us creates both risks and benefits for those around us, and everything we do creates both good and bad externalities. The fact that individuals do not always make choices which lead to optimal outcomes is no excuse for depriving them of those choices, much less for placing those choices in the hands of equally flawed and fallible politicians and public health officials. Does anyone seriously think it's a good idea to let experts who have spent 30 years obsessing over traffic fatalities dictate speed limits? Or to let people with pathological anxiety or an unhealthy penchant for micromanagement have control over what you can and can't do with your life? Many have been quick to point out that individual liberties are not absolute, and it's true that liberty is not absolute. But the authority of elected and unelected officials to curtail liberty is even less absolute still. It is not the exercise of rights that should be regarded as conditional and carefully monitored, but the abrogation of those rights that needs this restraint. The right to life does not include the right to directly compel or use a third party to compel your neighbor to give up their job and stay at home on the chance that him doing so might decrease the odds of someone else catching a disease. The pretext of public safety cannot be used to disarm citizens who have committed no violent crime, to prevent them from gathering, or to deprive them of property, nor should it have been used that way now, though it has been. During times of emergency, it is the responsibility of public officials, whether elected or appointed, to stand on principle, reaffirm, and vigorously protect those unalienable rights that are always most threatened when people get scared. Principles are no good if you throw them out the window during every crisis. There are times when public safety, whether real or perceived, must yield to individual liberty, and this is one of them. Some people might argue that mandatory face masks and vaccination are just a minor, reasonable intervention. But it is exactly because this is so apparently minor, so insidious, that it needs to be resisted. If grounds so minor as a theoretical increase in risk transmission of a single virus that doesn't even compare to the most minor actual plagues of history can be used to mandate something like what we've been through over the last year, then no risk is too small, and no future public health intervention will be too invasive. Mandatory masking to combat COVID-19, if successfully sustained on the basis of the current evidence in the name of public health, will lead to even worse infringements of essential liberty on similar pretexts that can and will be upheld. Mandatory face coverings are acting as the tip of the spear in a social context the same way that elite military units, such as the Persian Immortals or the Navy SEALs, act in a military context. Their role is both functional and symbolic. Mandatory masking is functional in the sense that masks can and do influence the beliefs and behavior of those wearing them. Mandatory masking constitutes an authoritarian foot in the door and a precedent which can be used for additional future erosion of God-given individual rights and liberties under a veneer of legality. And these face masks are symbolic in that their use or non-use is taken as a sort of statement of faith or belief which cannot be concealed. It's not just a mask. It's not a small thing, and it's not just a minor inconvenience. It is a practical outgrowth of the same fearful, authoritarian, paternalistic, coercive, evidence-blind mentality that has driven far too many people's response during this entire disgraceful episode. And after the boundaries of individual liberty have ceased to restrain such interventions, all other potential stopping points become arbitrary and ephemeral. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And trading the core liberty of a person's right to govern their most fundamental property, the mind and body that constitute their very person in the name of public health, for the mere possibility of increased safety from a single virus or even multiple viruses, is an absolutely terrible trade-off.